Hello and welcome to the Australia-Indonesia Centre and our first In Conversation for 2020. It's great to have you with us today for our first discussion for the year. And in fact, we're going to hold these on a regular basis, tapping into our network of experts and researchers across both countries and the region to talk about the issues that really matter. Now, for those of you that have joined, we have muted your sound and your video just so that we can manage our guest speakers and we don't lose them. So if you're trying to turn back those functions, don't worry about it. We've got it covered here. And we are going to allow for questions. We don't have the chat up at the moment. We'll definitely be putting that up on board a little bit later for you. We have, of course, already got some questions in the system, which is fantastic. We'll answer some of those and we'll try and get to you as many of those questions as possible. So let's have an introduction to our speakers. Aditya Uttami is co-founder of the Think Policy Society. The Think Policy Society is a community of young professionals that works for creative policy solutions based on empathy and evidence. Afu, as she likes to be called, also works at the World Bank as an environmental economist. And I must point out that but Afu is here in her capacity with the Think Policy Society and is very kindly giving us her time today. Thank you, Afu. Our second guest today is Professor Nunung Nuyatono. Now, Professor Nunung is the Dean of Economics and Management at Bogor's IPB University. He's also a member of Indonesia's National Research Council from 2019 to 2022, so still is. His research is focused on development economics, microfinance, and public policy. And our third speaker, of course, is our one and only Kevin Evans, Director in Jakarta for the Australia-Indonesia Centre. His 25 plus years of experience of living in Indonesia and working with various institutions means that he has deep insight into what's happening in that country. He's worked there as a diplomat, stockbroker, government advisor, academic, and much more. And I should say 35 years, not 25. Apologies, Kevin. Now, we thought that it was important to discuss the coronavirus and the impact that it's having on our region. And also, there are many, many roads we can go down with this pandemic. What do we discuss? And we will be looking at some other avenues in further discussions. What we wanted to look at today was the economics, because obviously this is a health crisis that's turned into an economic crisis as well. Now, as you know, the President Jokowi has asked people to stay at home, work from home, do social distancing measures. He shut down places of entertainment such as cinemas, and encouraging people to pray from home. Of course, we had the Finance Minister, Sri Mulyani, introduce a range of economic measures, which we will discuss. And everywhere, you know, there are questions about, is the Indonesian government doing enough? Or is any government doing enough? Governments around the world are being questioned about the measures they're taking to try and protect people's health and keep an economy going. And that is not an easy task. So, to start off our conversation, I thought it would be great just to get an idea on the ground from our guests of what's actually happening in their neighbourhood. What are they seeing in Indonesia? And then we can have a think about, is it similar to what we're seeing in Australia? And Kevin, I can see you're on screen, so I'll ask you first, what are you seeing in your neighbourhood?
Well, I've been asking some of my Ojek and Gojek friends how they're surviving. A number are now staying at home. Those who are on the road are finding fewer passengers. And I'm surprised, actually, even the food delivery applications, even the amount of orders they've got are down. Other poorer friends and relatives are now beginning to ask for a bit of help. So I think the traditional social safety net that people have relied on through family and friends is now beginning to kick in. But there may be some additional stresses this time on relying on that, as we were able to do during the Asian financial crisis. But I think we'll get into that later. But we've got blue sky.
Oh, that's good. But Afu, how about you? What are you seeing as a young Indonesian?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been I think on social media, we can see that people are starting to get bored of working from home because we're entering the fourth week. But I think being bored is the least of the kind of problems that we're actually seeing. And as you said, the health crisis has actually turned into an economic crisis and affected the most vulnerable really deeply. And I think, so similar to Kevin, I've also been talking to not only the ojek drivers, which is, I guess, more salient and kind of on top of our mind, but also people working in salons, people working in restaurants, the cafes that needs to be shut down, and some employers that need to let go some of their workers. So this, I mean, around even you know, among in the neighborhood, we've been talking about that as well, and thinking about how the government can put in economic measures that can help reduce some of those risks.
Thank you. And Professor Nanong, can you let us know what you're seeing?
Thank you, Helen. As I'm working in the university, since our university implement partially closed down, meaning that most of our students went back home. So we can see the impact, like for example, canteen, warung surrounding university, canteen in the university closed down, warung surrounding university drastically, their onset is decreased. So we can see the impact of COVID-19, meaning that because all students as well as lecturers working from home, so will impact on the economy surrounding campus. So it is again a big problem, and then we have to face that immediately. We see that the impact of the coronavirus or COVID-19 is not just only in the economic activity as usual, but also in the campus itself. The daily activities also change. Now we are using online media, giving a lecture, exam, and things like that.
Thank you. And Pak Nanong, we'll stay with you because there are, of course, when people think about a financial crisis and Indonesia, one of the first things that comes to mind is the financial crisis of 1998, Krismon. How do you compare what happened in 1998 to what you're seeing now? How is it different?
In 1998, it was due to the monetary crisis. Then the impact really heavy on the certain group of economic groups. Like for example, at the time, the economic activity is still on the street. Like for example, there are many informal sector still also serve the people. Then it's very different because nowadays the impact of economy not just only hit a certain or particular sector, but also all sectors has an impact, has an influence by the COVID-19. So this is a big challenge and big difference between 1998 and 2020 due to the COVID-19. So therefore, we need more high effort and serious effort. As I mentioned the impact is from the impact also hit micro and medium enterprises. When the crisis 1998, small, micro, and medium enterprises was as a backbone of our economy. The informal sector there, and then the consumption is still keep maintained. But we can see now is very different. The warung also decrease in their onset. So the impact on the micro, small, and medium enterprise is quite also high, not just only in the big company, but also the informal sector. So again, we have to look on that issue, that this is different circumstances in 1998 and to 2020.
Thank you for that. And lovely to see your son, by the way. It's a new working from home hazard. Back to some of the serious points that you've raised, and perhaps we'll pick up on Krismon and comparisons a bit later on in the conversation, but Kevin Evans has been doing a bit of research, looking at some economic historical data and also what is happening now. And Kevin, could you give us, I guess, an overview of what you see happening in Indonesia and Australia and other parts of the world in terms of the economic hit that is being taken?
Well, I think the first point to note is that we're seeing an unprecedented downgrade in projected rates of growth. So I've done a little bit of work with the G20 economies, working on some work put together by the Economist Intelligence Unit. So it indicated they were projecting at the late 2019 that this year we'd have a kind of a balmy global expansion of 2.3%. This has now been revised within a couple of months to say a global contraction of 2.2%. That's a tremendous change in an incredibly short period of time, a 4.5% shift basically in global projections. Now the G20 nations represent 85% of the world economy, so that's why I've given a bit of a focus there. So you can see on the chart here that the regions of the Americas and Europe are looking to see the sharpest downgrades in growth. They're suggesting at this stage that the only areas expected to see any sort of growth are the three big Asian nations of China, India, and Indonesia. However, I personally think that there's still more prospects of a risk on the downside, not the upside. And it was very interesting to note last week that Indonesia's finance minister, Sri Mulyani, indicated that we could look at the possibility here, even in Indonesia, of a contraction. Could we take a look at the next chart, which I think clears away most of the others and leaves us with a sharper focus on Indonesia and Australia? If that chart was available. So when we see this, or when we do look at this chart, what it's showing actually is that both Australia and Indonesia will be somewhat less impacted in terms of downgrades on economic growth than elsewhere. Even so, the likely actual performance will be the worst that Indonesia's produced since the Asian financial crisis of 1998. And in fact, for Australia, we have to go back to 1983 to look at a contraction of the scale that we're looking to now. So really serious stuff.
That quite sobering statistics, and as we know, just probably at the start of understanding what's happening. Alfu, if I can go to you, just for a different perspective, a young Indonesian who has known democracy, who has known economic growth, is part of a cohort that have great aspirations for the country and are looking to improve their lives and the lives of those around them. What are you seeing, or what questions are your friends and colleagues asking at this time about the economy and what's happening to it?
Yeah, I think on the general population, the young people on social media and just in general have this sense of basically a looming sense of uncertainty and inaction from the government in terms of what they're working on as a response to this, I guess, health crisis and economic crisis. So in a way, even though, we know that on the news, the government's been releasing this economic package and all these different measures, I think there's a great sense of insufficiency. Like I think the perception of the public, or the young people especially, is that the government of Indonesia is not doing enough. There are a lot of questions or demands for some kind of more strict health measures or kind of economic activities limitation measures, like a lockdown or partial lockdown. There are some demands on how the government maybe should strict Ramadan-related movement going back to hometowns, because that can potentially also spread the disease from Jakarta, which is the epicenter at the moment. So there's been a lot of uneasiness or worry around what the government's actually doing. And this might speak more to how the government's communicating what they're working on as opposed to, actual inaction. But at the same time, they're also, feeling of, again, that the government's not doing enough tests on the ground, that maybe the data that we're seeing in terms of number of infected people are an underreporting situation, so there are some numbers comparing how other countries are doing in terms of number of tests conducted, and Indonesia is pretty low on that list. So I think young people and the general populace at large also think that the government can do more in terms of doing some of this testing. But on the positive side, I guess, to feel a little bit more optimistic, as a result of that feeling that the government's not doing enough, I think some people, communities are trying to contribute themselves, are trying to take some of the matters to their own hands, I think, in a way, through several things, starting from actually, making donations through online platforms. There's some statistics showing that, around 3 to 5% of millennials are used to making donations on website. So I think, platforms like Kita Bisa, We Care, and so on I've started seeing, these large donations of billions of rupiah coming from young people and general populace alike, to make masks, to make protective suits, and actually directly helping the people in need just through logistical support, food, and cash for these people. And at the same time, I think some people who are people on social media have started also a movement to kind of tip your ojek drivers more if you order food or anything like that. And now they've increased the cap from what was before maybe around $1 to now up to like $20. So you can donate a lot more. And also the most exciting one, I think, is this like buy your ojek driver lunch movement, where you pretend like you're ordering GoFood, but at the end you ask the ojek driver to actually take the food for themselves. And I think it's quite encouraging to see that there's this movement or like self-reliance to some extent, that the community is trying to help each other beyond the economic packages that the government's preparing.
Thank you. That's really interesting, especially that civil movement, which is strong in Indonesia, that sense of the community needs to step in here. There's a gap and we need to help out. So Professor Nanong, if I can go to you then, Afu's mentioned that the government has taken some measures, and I'll just refer to my notes to make sure I've got this correct. There is about 40 billion Australian dollars announced in total so far. Rupiah 405.1 trillion. And the Finance Minister Sri Mulyani announced some extra measures following Joko Widodo's, the President's announcement. Now, part of these measures include a budget for the pre-employment card program that will be sufficient to cover 5.6 million laid-off workers, informal workers, and micro and small business owners. There are 2 tax measures to help the manufacturing sector. There are some economic recovery programs, including credit restructuring and financing for small and medium-sized businesses. And there's even in a Perpu, which was the President's decree, allowing the ability for the debt to GDP to increase. What do you make of these measures? Are they going to have an impact? Are they having an impact? Will they be enough?
First, the important effort should be directed how government flattening the curve is very important. Since if the effort the government to flattening the curve is not happening, then it would be a serious problem. Even there are huge money to be fiscal stimulus for different purposes. So that's why, like in rupiah, there are around 75 trillion rupiah directed for the health recovery and then for the protective equipment. This is very important for the frontline doctor, nurse, and other voluntary people, young people that really hand in hand trying to battle COVID-19. Once we success to reduce the spreading of COVID-19, then we simultaneously we can start to provide a different fiscal policy. Like for example, as also stated, how important the social safety net, around 110 trillion rupiah will be directed for the social safety net. It is very important since there are also still around 9% people below poverty line. And moreover, it's also still around, let's say, 9 million people, or 5% living in extreme poverty. So this is very important. it is almost similar with 1998 when the crisis hit the economy, then the number of poor people will increase. So that's why quick response from the government should be needed, not just only in by central government, but also local government can work together with the central government. Another important point is like tax incentive and the credit for the we call it credit usaha rakyat, KUR. It is also very important, as I mentioned you. In 1998, small, micro, medium business is very important. Now they really influence and have a big impact by COVID-19. So that's why the relaxation of the flexibility of medium, of small and micro enterprise paying a loan is very important and needed. And also the 150 trillion program from the government to recover economy. So we have to again see if this all fiscal stimulus really targeted to the people. The question is that whether the people that needed to have this kind of assistance is received a certain number that government plan. So how government can make sure that the targeted people is really benefit from the fiscal policy stimulus. And when we see the different action taken by G20 countries, it's almost similar. Like for example, how we can put a certain amount of money to for the health and economic recovery, for medium small enterprises, and as well as for relaxing the credit. And the important question is that you raise as in Perpu that government just, I think yesterday, the Ministry of Finance met with the Parliament asking about the approval of the deficit, the deficit above 3% of GDP. It is again very important. If we just strict 3% from the GDP, then the fiscal room of the fiscal room of the government is very tight. So by relaxing the deficit until 2023, then the government have enough room to maneuver and then to give a stimulus of economy. But again, the question is how government really can target it all the program to the people that are needed for the assistance. I believe that the number of poor people in Indonesia will increase. Indonesian government have a target to make a zero extreme poverty by 2024. Of course, this program will be delayed for a bit because all economic sector hit by the COVID-19. Yeah, to me, again, all sectors, all government institutions should make sure that the program is on target. This is my response related to the fiscal stimulus just issued by the government.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Professor Nanong. And Kevin Evans, you've also been doing some numbers based on the government's announcements around the kind of fiscal stimulus and help that it hopes to put out into the community. Perhaps could you just take us through and show us how those, how that program stacks up against what you're seeing economically?
Okay, well, I think the first point to note, and this would underscore what Pak Nunung said before, this particular economic crisis is unlike others we've faced before. It wasn't caused by some fundamental integrity or other flaw in the financial system. It wasn't caused by some traditional cyclical imbalance in the macroeconomy. The basic cause of this economic crisis has been an unprecedented collapse in discretionary consumption and income, especially at the household level, and a connected incapacitation of production and a breakdown in supply chains. So the basic velocity of economic activity has been reduced dramatically. So given the centrality of households to this economic crisis, any public financing program needs to address this challenge. And I actually believe that the package announced through the emergency government regulation you mentioned before, the Perpu of the 31st of March, I think contains an appropriate focus there. So it's valued, as you mentioned before, at 40 billion. This includes a doubling of the health budget, 11 billion for poor households. Now, what's an interesting point there for Indonesia is that going back 20 years, actually the country did not have the administrative architecture to actually provide money to individual poor people. Poverty programs tended historically to be defined in a geographic, so backward regions or poor regions, rather than as poor citizens. And so when they doubled the price of fuel in 2005, actually they at the same time created, or what I say, they gave birth to Indonesia's social welfare system. So it was a dramatic transformation of using public funds to actually support individual poor people. So the programs that they're targeting are actually two pre-existing social safety net programs. So that's really an important administrative piece of architecture that exists and can easily be ramped up. They don't have to invent and start from scratch to create something. So I think that will be a very helpful thing to ensure a fast rollout. Of course, the number of people to be affected is going to increase dramatically, particularly in some of those services sectors that are now being closed down, whether it's tourism, restaurants, transport, and so forth. But at least there is a basic mechanism that exists administratively, financially, and so forth for that to operate. So that's important. There'll also be some support to small and medium enterprises that Pak Nunung also outlined, plus some tax relief. So I see in that there's been a reduction, they're reducing corporate tax rates from 25 down to 20% over the next couple of years. So that's important elements. Whether it's enough, yep, sorry.
So I was going to say, I think you had a chart. Was it chart number 2? I was looking at one of your charts, Kevin.
Right.
I think that gives us a bit of a picture of what's going on. Perhaps.
Sure. Okay. So we could look at. Okay. So what we're looking at there is I created, maybe back 20 years ago when I was on the stock market, I created a kind of a snapshot way of identifying which country was most badly affected in terms of what loss to wealth did that society suffer as a result of the Asian financial crisis. So I've used the same kind of formula here, basically taking the stock exchange indices of major market economies around the region, converting them into US dollars, taking a starting point being before a crisis emerges and then sometime later. So the picture you've got there in front of you now is only 3 months into this crisis. So we're not over it yet. This isn't the end of the game. And so what it's actually showing is just how much you've lost. So if I put $100 into each of these markets just before the crisis, so the end of last year, so before anybody was seriously looking at the impact of COVID. So looking at all of these market economies across the region, what you've got left now is my $100, I've still got $82 in Japan. When you're looking at the other end, the most affected as at the end of March was actually Australia, Thailand, and Indonesia. So we've lost $35 in Australia, we've lost $39 in Indonesia. We're still in the middle of the crisis, so these numbers will change and change rather sharply, but it's interesting to see just what we're suffering now. Maybe if we could show that other chart, which looks at the end of the Asian financial crisis, which is a lot more shocking, particularly from an Indonesian perspective. So this shows what happened. So prior to the beginning of the Asian financial crisis, and then I bought my $100 on each of these markets. And then I sold them about a year and a bit later. So after the dust had settled and so forth, we looked at Australia did the best out of that. So Australians still had 74% of their wealth. Indonesians were left with $9. Now, in a practical sense, obviously markets are rather hyper-responsive and often tend to overreact, of course. But if you look at things like property prices, even those declined dramatically. At my personal experience, I was dumb enough to buy a property here in Indonesia just before the crisis, thinking this will pass, no problems. And I think it was about $150,000 American. At about that time, it was left at about 40,000. So that was actual real prices. What I'm showing you here was actually on the equities market, which are much more responsive to these kind of changes. So the impact is significant in terms of what that actually leaves a society. And the devastation that Indonesia suffered during the Asian financial crisis was reflected there. And so many lessons were learned from that period that, interestingly enough, when the global financial crisis struck 10 years later, a lot of the fundamental flaws in governance, fundamental flaws in finance systems and integrity systems had been redressed to the point that actually Indonesia and Australia too, in many respects, but particularly Indonesia, sailed through the global financial crisis, barely skipping a beat. So the losses that you saw there were nothing like that. But this time, we're still fairly early in, but it seems that we've got some bad times ahead of us.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Your charts are always stark, to say the least, and a good explainer. I'm going to open the floor to questions very shortly. We have got as I said, we've got some questions that came in yesterday. I'm going to take one of those now because I think it's relevant to what we've been discussing. This is from Ben Bland, the Research Fellow and Director of the Southeast Asia Project Lowy Institute, which is based in Sydney. Can Jokowi really hope to protect the economy and jobs while a health crisis breaks out? Now, this is the question, and you started answering it, Kevin. You feel like he's going down the right path. Maybe, Afu, could I ask you that from a young policymaker perspective? What are your thoughts at the moment? And then I'll go to our other two speakers. Can he really hope to protect the economy and jobs while there's a health crisis in the country?
Yeah, I think the quick answer is no. And I think it's a matter of the degree and the scale, the magnitude of, the trade-off between those two, right? So actually at Think Policy Society, and just as a quick introduction, we're a network of young people in Indonesia working in the public sector. So some of our members work in ministries, government agencies, some in private sector, but dealing with kind of public public related issues. And some in CSOs or international organizations like myself. And one exercise that we tried to do actually just last week is kind of looking at these different evaluation criteria, right? To what extent can you limit the spread or the infection of the virus vis-a-vis, how much you want to contain the economic recession, and thinking about the economic effects both in the short term and in the long term, right? Because I guess the more aggressive measures you introduce today will, create a much bigger shock to the economy in the short term. But if it allows you to kind of limit the length of the spread or, how big the health crisis is, then it's gonna give you more time in the long term to actually recover the economy. So we did some of this exercise just to kind of be thinking. I mean, we don't have the answer per se because it was like a one workshop exercise, but I think it helps us to think about putting ourselves in the government shoes and thinking about all these different trade-offs and what ultimately needs to be, what the decision makers need to be thinking about is what are the most optimum, I guess, the most cost-effective way to contain the health outbreaks vis-a-vis trying to make sure that the economy, I think it will be affected. Ministry of Finance has already issued an estimate of GDP growth decline for this year because of the crisis. But it's a matter of how much you can contain that, especially thinking about, again, the vulnerable families, right? Thinking about the aspiring middle class. Kevin earlier, mentioned the administrative advantage of using existing programs. But I think at the same time, there may be like new poor or new vulnerable communities who are previously in an aspiring middle class position, who has enough income and all of that, and they wasn't one of the beneficiaries of the existing government programs, but are now vulnerable because the tourism sector is gravely affected. All these online based services, the Ojek online and all of that are also affected. So what about this new poor or new, keluarga rentan and keluarga miskin, right? How do we target them? especially, and this is interesting, and this has a historical connection as well, social assistance in Indonesia tend to be provided at a family level, kind of with the Family Hope program and all of that. But what about the single individuals who one might not be recorded because they don't have KTP to access some of this, they don't have an ID card to access some of these assistances, or because they don't belong in a family, maybe because they're a sexual minority. So there are this additional layer of vulnerable group in the community that might be in need of accessing this assistance, but don't have access to them. So just kind of putting it out there as a thought as well, as part of the trade-off that we're thinking of in this situation.
It's a great point. Yeah, thank you, Afu. That's a really good point about new demographics, different demographics, shifting demographics that need to be taken into consideration. Professor Nanung, what do you think? The question is, can Jokowi really hope to protect the economy and jobs while a health crisis breaks out?
Yeah.
Tough question.
Sorry, Helen?
Tough question, really. It's a hard one to answer. We'll pop that question up on the screen again for you, Pat.
Okay.
And for the audience.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. This is interesting question. If we see the evidence in Indonesia nowadays, people from Jakarta or migrant people now back to their hometown. Is it the rational decision, or how we can think why people still back on their hometown? Of course, we can see if they are still living in Jakarta, for example, they don't have enough income because many migrant people working based on, some of them working in the informal sectors. Now informal sector is closed down. So then they try to decide to go on their hometown. Since we know that some of the people, they have a big hope. When I back home, then the social capital, gotong royong in my hometown is still strong enough. So that's why I decided to back home. But then again, the question related to whether the Jokowi program strong enough to recover the economy due to the COVID-19, again, it is depend on how effective program deliver to the people, vulnerable people, from the vulnerable family, because they really hit strong by the COVID-19. And second, and that I also want to propose or to answer the question is related that are the around 450 trillion rupiah enough to protect the Indonesian economy? Since the epicentrum in Jakarta and mostly in Java, and Java is the center of economic growth in Indonesia. Around 50 to 90% of economic growth come from Java Island. So that's why, again, it is very important to know how Java economies can struggle, and Java economies, Java Island economy, I mean, can still maintain the positive growth. Even, of course, the economic growth will decline drastically. Are there still any room for the government to improve their economy? One emphasize that I already mentioned earlier, that it depends on the government response. If the response is on the right way to flattening the curve, we can then make it shorter the duration and the deep of COVID-19. But if the response of the government too late, then I will, of course, be a doubt whether the economic of Indonesia can immediately back to the normal. Back to 1998, it took around 2 years after our GDP minus then back to around 40% growth. We plan to have a 5% point something this year of our economic growth, but then our economic will be hit by COVID-19. So how long then our economic will then recover? So again, it is depend on how effective all the program directed to not only the people, but also sectors, incentive, and other more new job that can be created by the government.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Afu. I'm going to go to another question because it does touch on the economics, but also ties in a bit with what you were saying, Professor Nanong, about what you're seeing on campus and what you were saying, Afu, about young people and, you know, they have a better lifestyle, but maybe that's now at risk, which will come down to including education and what's going on with education. And I'm just bringing this in now because I think it might progress the conversation in a useful way. And we also have a question from the audience. Erica Tippett, who's a project manager at Monash University, asks, what areas of education and research are at risk in the economic downturn, and how can partners assist their Indonesian colleagues in recovery? I'll give you a moment to think about that. Perhaps, Kevin, I'll go with you first. I know that this is something you've been keeping an eye on, but I'd be very interested to hear from our other guests as well. And just to let people know too that the chat line is open. So if you would like to ask a question, you can type that in to the chat box, and that will get to us, and we'll have a look at it and see if we can get it to our presenters, our panelists. So Kevin, what areas of education and research are at risk in the economic downturn?
Well, I think obviously anything that's face-to-face is going to have some immediate difficulties. I think also we're going to see an explosion of online work. So perhaps actually the digital education space may actually be coming into its own. It's been growing quite quickly for several years, but there may actually be space for some accelerated growth. So as we look to the new normal after this settles, we may see more of that sort of thing, universities online and so forth. So I think a lot of the education is physically being closed down steadily. Universities probably before others, schools less so, but then a lot of people don't have access to online. So a lot of kids are simply not getting anything. And so that'll be a major problem for those children. On the research side, there'll no doubt be a quick readjustment as universities and companies pour a lot more resources into trying to work out how they might be able to engage in research focused on dealing with this immediate crisis. So research work that's not really able to be related to this crisis across many disciplines. So it's not just looking at the epidemiology or virology of this, it's everything. So whether it's transport systems, economic systems, cultural systems, whatever, each can have its own aspect on this. If it's not really possible to focus or to see an angle on that, it may be that that's downgraded in priority in the immediate future.
Apu, what are your thoughts on this? Education risk, how can we work together? How can Australia help Indonesia, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that in terms of timing of this crisis, right, in the past, just couple of years, actually, online learning platforms have, more recently flourished in Indonesia, especially for the, I guess, K-12 levels of elementary school, middle, high school, and so on. So to some extent, in areas where the internet connectivity and just the digital infrastructure is more reliable, the disruption seems to be contained to a certain degree. I see videos of students learning from home. There are some complaints from the parents, but that's another part that we can joke about. But I think, in terms of the platform itself, to some extent, there are some learning processes that can be shifted already to the existing digital infrastructure. And it's interesting that some of my juniors in college, people I know who are still kind of going to university, actually say that to some extent the learning process has become more effective with less distractions in the classroom. But maybe this is not for everyone. Maybe this is more true to certain learning styles. But in terms of research, I'm guessing that it again depends on the discipline. Some of the research that can be done or has been done through more of a kind of like desk or literature-based work, data, existing database work can still continue. I myself am an environmental economics researcher, and I see very minimum distraction or disruption to the work that I'm working on. But I'm guessing for some disciplines that require primary data collection, going through somewhere, this strict this constraint of being more mobile will affect that. And to the question of how can the community helps, I think that's I'm happy to hear more ideas, but that's definitely like a challenge. And also, I think, and I think this is true for many people who have just started doing research in the past 2 or 3 months, kind of having this existential research question as to whether my research is still relevant against this new, economic crisis. Like, how can I make some of the policy recommendations that I've started writing still relevant, amidst this new situation, because it changes the whole economic landscape. Some of the questions around, in my case, natural resources management type recommendation, like how can we make that still relevant or even more relevant to this post-COVID situation, kind of thinking about maybe, how land-based labor-intensive jobs can be a potential response to, creating or recovering the economy. Anticipating maybe an exodus, I don't know if that's too big of a word, but, people maybe moving back to the rural areas as they lost their jobs in the city centers. So I think many researchers are having the same questions, right? How can I make my, especially policy research, sorry, I had to highlight that, but like some of the policy researchers, how can you make your work still relevant against this new pandemic?
And you mentioned then the workers moving back to the country. Professor Nanong has raised that as a concern in terms of managing the health aspect of it and controlling the spread. Is that something that's come up in your conversations? Are you looking at that shift potentially from city to rural? The annual pilgrimage, the mudik, which is going to happen soon, is apparently already happening. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. Again, timing is very interesting, right? Because this is, Ramadan and people are starting to go back. First and foremost, I think it's interesting that the government's not doing any like more stricter limitations to this mass movement, because I think the health impacts can be anticipated and it's real and it can be huge. But I think secondly, if this mass movement happened after Indonesia reached the peak, as to, saying that if the I think what I was discussing about is more on the movement of people going back to the villages a little bit after the pandemic or the worst health situation has passed. So I think that can be an interesting momentum actually to start thinking about maybe, with all these fiscal packages being allocated and also existing, financing for sustainability measures, maybe that new, movement of people from the cities to the rural areas can create a new opportunity and momentum to shift, agricultural practices to a more sustainable one, creating new job opportunities around natural resources management, like around, fire prevention, peatland management, water level management in the rural areas, as a way to create jobs and kind of run the economy, while also, using this as an opportunity to bring or to achieve Indonesia's own climate agenda at the same time. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of like still a rough idea, but I think there are opportunities in the rural areas, in the natural resources rich areas, to kind of use some of these resources in a way that also help deliver sustainable outcomes.
Okay. Look, I might pick up on that, and just with the question that we've had come in as well, which looks at, again, the outside Java, for instance, the other parts of Indonesia. And Professor Nanong, maybe this is for you, from Roberta Colzani. To what degree will the economic retraction have on the internal geopolitics in Indonesia, such as the effect on the outer regions and provinces being additionally economically dislocated? And I guess, yeah, what is going to be the impact on those outer regions, which were already struggling or disconnected from the wealth of the main island of Java?
Yeah, okay, as I mentioned earlier, that around 50 to 60% Java Island contribute to economic development in Indonesia. And now, if we see the number of positive COVID-19 is also the center of the epicenter, I mean, is still in Jakarta, West Java, East Java. But then if we look on the outside of Java, there's still a lower number of positive COVID-19. So that's why it is very important again to really protect the area outside of the Java, while they still keep maintaining their economic activity. Even it is also difficult because without interaction with people, it's difficult to run the business and then to have an the activities. But I would suggest, maybe this is related to the situation where maybe they can start producing by in small scale called creative economy, I would say. They can base from the household, and then base from the household and then a community. Even they don't interact each other, but can be still managed by one voluntary managing all this activity. Just give an example, the needed of the mass now is quite huge. Why don't try the household that have a capacity to produce this one, then can be produced like mass, and then be sold in Jakarta or in Java Island, where the COVID-19.
Okay. I think your screen's frozen. That internet is being overloaded everywhere. But that was good. Thank you, Professor Nanong. So many questions are coming in. We can't answer all of them. I'm sorry. I think two perhaps that we can finish on. One is around infrastructure. The government, of course, had huge plans for infrastructure investment in Indonesia this year. I'll get a brief response on that. And then close, I guess, to the relationship between Australia and Indonesia is the impact on tourism. And in Bali in particular, we've heard of the devastating consequences of not having tourists. So the question there is around, when would we likely to see anything like that get back to normal? I'll just get two questions and some quick responses from you all. Just because we're running out of time mainly, but I want to get those in. So firstly, infrastructure. Kevin Evans?
Oh, look, I suspect this is not what we saw in terms of the new economic package is not the last. There will be additional readjustments of investment priorities, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to see some of those kind of investments even on infrastructure, although they're still arguing they're going to push forward. I wouldn't be surprised to see some shunting back in order to provide more immediate support to the current urgent situation.
Afu, you can answer one, both, or none at all, if you choose. Infrastructure, of course, huge area for public policy.
Yeah, it is. I think it really depends. I think Also, when we're thinking about infrastructure, I guess if we're thinking about how to leverage Village Fund, for example, to build infrastructure in the rural areas in a way that can help generate, again, rural jobs, and which will be critical after, as part of the bouncing back the economy. But I'm guessing large infrastructure projects, allocating resources would be difficult in terms of the state budget, and bringing more investment from foreign will also be challenging. So I think it really depends. We have to break down the infrastructure conversation into several subsectors. Yeah.
Fair comment. And just on the Bali comment, which may seem flippant, but it's not, because it has such a wide impact. I'm just reading a question here. Our school is provided for underprivileged children in Sumba Island, and every year we send 60 students to resorts and hotels in Bali. Our school is now closed, and with no real time, we don't understand when we'll reopen in the future, and our alumni have been sent back by their employers. Is there any rough prediction when the economic situation can be better again? And that just sums up just one of the challenges facing the country. Professor Nanung, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, based on many predictions that the peak of this COVID-19 in Indonesia will be either June or July. So I predict that 3 months afterward, we still trying to normalize all economic activity. So hopefully by at least the last quarter of this year, we start to recover our economy. So I highly put emphasis for friends in Australia, please come to Indonesia, in Bali particularly, or other tourist destination once we get a normal again. Of course, the tourist is one of the biggest sector that hit by COVID-19. Hotel, restaurants, and other art and related job to tourism, transportation, logistics. Now is getting down.
And finally, Kevin, your predictions on how long it will take Indonesia to get through this?
Well, I think much of it is going to depend on how the health side is going to be managed. I have to say there was a bit of criticism that the government hasn't kind of put military on the roads to stop people moving, much as say they did in India. I think what the Indonesian government's been doing is actually setting in place mechanisms so people feel comfortable about staying where they are. So those new welfare, the social safety net programs, frankly, have to be put in place before you then start really trying to stop people moving. They've also worked quite assiduously with the religious groups to get them to pray at home and also to reduce mixing of people in big groups, even during this Ramadan period, which is, of course, where there's much more frenetic exchange and movements and gatherings of people. So I think they're setting up a really very important period of time for this country in dealing with the problem. I think we saw in China, it really got out of hand because they didn't act fast enough to try to slow down the traditional annual movements associated with Chinese New Year. In India, they just basically pulled the shutters down before any kind of program of support for people who are suddenly now going to be out of work with nowhere to live, nowhere to eat. That was put in place, I think, a bit abruptly before there was a social safety net. So I think they've been putting that in place here. Now people are still going to be, leaking out to go back to the villages. So I think very much it depends, not so much just on turning the curve, but actually getting it much, much lower before we can see much of an opening. And my sense is towards the end of the year, we might start to be in a position where people may feel comfortable about moving about once again. But I don't think in the immediate period, we'll probably need to see how it goes through to Ramadan and beyond, into post-Ramadan. I suspect we may be needing some additional fiscal support programs. At this stage, the value of the one announced last week, was really about 2.5% of GDP. What Australia has done, I think, catches up more towards about 8 to 10%. So what the country's done was a great start, but there may still be, and I think it has capacity to actually do a bit more because levels of indebtedness are relatively modest and manageable.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. And that's where we'll have to leave our conversation for today. Unfortunately, so much more we could ask of our panelists. I'd like to thank Kevin Evans from the Australia-Indonesia Centre, our Jakarta-based director, Aditya Utami, who's co-founder of the Think Policy Society, a group of young policy professionals in Indonesia. Thank you so much, and lovely to have you join us. And Professor Nanung Nuyatono, from the Dean of the Economics and Management at Bogor's IPB FEB University. Thank you very much, Professor Nanung, for your time too. I know you all are incredibly busy and we do value it. And we're sure to get you on again in the near future. So thank you. And thank you also for joining us, for taking such an interest in this discussion. We're going to hold another In Conversation in about 3 weeks' time. So pencil in Wednesday, April the 29th into your calendars. And we are going to look at coronavirus again, but this time from a public health policy perspective, having a look at some of those health measures and getting a conversation between Australia and Indonesia on perhaps where can we work together, how can we help each other, how can we learn from each other about what is going on. So I hope you can join me then. And of course, in the meantime, log on to our website, get in touch with us. We provide information on a regular basis, and we'd love to have you join in our community. Thank you very much.